All right, welcome to the Craig Cannon Power Hour with Craig Cannon. Um, I'm not Craig Cannon, but I'm here with Craig Cannon, and I guess I will let you explain what happened today. Normally, we don't talk about current events, especially when there's like very little information, but something very significant happened today. You will be able to summarize it better than I can, and you will also be able to summarize why you are uniquely qualified to comment on this. And so I will just let you talk and shut up, and then we can get out of here. Let's.
Okay. Well,
I'll ask questions, but
today, Abe Shinzo, the former prime minister of Japan, was assassinated during a speech in.
I saw that he got shot. He died.
Well, okay. The phrase that's used in the news right now is that his heart has stopped. That he suffered, which they're translating in English as cardiac arrest. But this is a common thing that we'll say before someone's been officially declared dead by a coroner. They say their heart has stopped.
Oh, okay. So he's dead.
Yeah. So that, I mean, there's the slimmest of slim chances they may have done something uh, if they were fast enough to reroute blood through like an oxygenator or something, but I think that's very unlikely.
Okay.
Further, he was shot by a shotgun at very close range twice. Once, apparently with some bleeding from the neck, but images I've seen, it doesn't look too severe. But the main one would be he was shot in the back at pretty close range. And that doesn't bode well for your survival.
Yeah.
Further, the weapon, the rumors that I hear, and these are repeated in media, but they're still essentially rumors. But they do kind of fit with images I've seen of the incident. The shotgun in question does not appear to be like a regular manufactured hunting type shotgun. It seems to be maybe homemade, maybe a zip gun. I don't know. If it is a zip gun, that also opens the possibility that the entire thing might be homemade. That's possible too. Isn't the rounds themselves may also be? I don't know. There is a black market here for weapons, so
Yeah.
there's a black market for weapons everywhere. But anyway, question marks on what exactly the nature of the weapon was, though shotgun is what's said most commonly. Seems like it could be a zip gun. The guy who did it, it was not a team strike or anything. It was a single guy who got close to him during the speech and just blasted him from behind. The guy's in his 40s. No knowledge yet on family situation with him. The most significant bit of information I've heard so far is that he's a former Japanese Navy personnel, but I don't know. Apparently he separated from the military in 2006 or so. So he's been out for a while. All that put together, there's a few different ranges of speculation about motive, and we don't have like a letter yet. We don't have a manifesto yet. We don't have any statements from the guy yet.
I just saw something on Twitter that said I didn't read it carefully, but it said that that according to him, the statement was that he was that he had the intent to kill, which, no shit, but apparently
Right.
there is a statement, but okay.
Right. So the thing is, intent to kill. Well, that was pretty firmly demonstrated. What was the reason behind it? The motivation behind it is
Said he was dissatisfied with him, he's okay.
right. And so
So I want to.
dissatisfaction with Abe takes there's a few different brands of discussion about Abe, and it kind of they follow Trump lines.
Okay.
One of them is that he's solely responsible for economic trouble.
So should mention to anyone who's new, you're a former Army intelligence analyst and you live in Japan. So that's why I'm just for anyone.
Right, yeah.
For anyone who's
I
new.
live here in Japan. I was in the Rangers and the infantry when I first went to the Army, like right after 9/11. Then I went to Special Forces as an SF engineer. Then I transitioned to intelligence and have been working increasingly. Like, the longer I've been out of the military, the more contracting I've done in the intelligence area after having separated. But anyway, yeah. So I live here. I'm fairly plugged into the politics here.
Okay. Yes.
Anyway, dissatisfaction with Abe runs along Trump lines, where you get these different narratives. One of them is Abe and Trump were working together to save us from global homo. That's one storyline. That makes the global homo people absolutely hate them. Leftoids absolutely hate these two guys. Another narrative is that they are global homo shills that were just tricking people into thinking they were against global homo. So that's the conspiracy theory version of dissatisfaction. And the other brand of dissatisfaction is kind of orthogonal to that, and it's low status men who are dissatisfied with their lot in life, who lost their job, and in the course of that lost their path towards a love life and intimacy. Those type of men that feel lost and left behind.
Okay.
This guy's in his 40s. He's a former military guy. That kind of fits that brand, but I don't know which level. The thing is, like with the coronavirus lockdowns and shit happening initially under Trump and Abe, there's people who that is their proof that these are global homo shills. And they view that as like the existential threat for all of humanity. And so they blame them for that.
Can you maybe briefly explain? So we talked about why you're uniquely qualified. Can you maybe summarize as best as you can and as briefly as you can what kind of maybe give a 5-minute explanation of Japanese politics? What are sort of the various factions? What are the kind of issues that come up? And how does it? So Japan is in on paper a parliamentary democracy. In practice, it's a feudal system, and so kind of there's a bit of kayfabe going on there. But
right, yeah. So Japan does still have an emperor. Going back in Japanese history, Japan was not a unified single country. It was considered it considered generally itself a nation. There was some sense of what it was to be Japanese under the emperor going way back, but all of the different fiefdoms were in contention directly.
It's sort of like Greece, maybe kind of like the ancient
right.
Greek
The Greek city-states would go to war against one another, but they would band together against the Persians.
Right. Okay.
So there was like interesting warfare, right? But when for example the Mongolian Chinese reconnaissance mission showed up in the northeast coast to see what there was even in Japan or how hard it would be to conquer, and the Japanese showed up to have this like battle between. So Japanese combat back in these days, you'd have prefectures versus prefectures fighting, but there was like kind of a code of conduct to it, where yes, you're at war, but doing things like killing shopkeepers and farmers is absolutely forbidden because it's the dirtiest thing you can do. It also ruins whatever you were going to try to win. You know, why would you kill off the farmers of the fields you're going to take over? That's ridiculous. So you leave them out of it. And after skirmishes and you know, various kind of preliminary combats, quite often what would be considered the ideal culmination of a fight between two leaders would be them facing off personally in single combat at the end. And this basically that practice actually spares the majority of the army from having the situation of total warfare. So there's sort of a customary practice to that type of war. There's a little bit of ritual to it. And that also involves the same practices we saw in feudal Europe, which is leaders parlaying before a battle, things like that. There's an etiquette. You're going to go throw down, but there would be an etiquette prior to the fight in many cases. Not all, but in many cases. So anyway, this Mongolian reconnaissance shows up, and instead of talking, they just start like chopping people up. And well, because nobody's formed for battle yet, they just like wipe out this whole town. They pack up and they go back to Mongolia and they go, "Yay, that was easy." Well, so the next time that had this profound impact on Japanese culturally, especially in that region, where they decided that, okay, if one prefecture is fighting another prefecture, all of the rules apply. But if anybody comes from overseas, we don't discuss things with them. We don't treat them as if they're human, because they're not. They're just aliens. Nobody who would pick a fight without even talking about it first should be considered human. So when the Mongolians showed back up with their larger force, the Japanese villagers, the farmers, the shopkeepers, even the women, everybody went out in fast boats to chop these people up in their boats and burn them to death with no discussions, no prisoners taken. It was just an absolute slaughter. There was no discussion. It was like, oh, it's go time. Let's go. And everyone dropped what they were doing, and they just murdered everybody.
That makes sense so that the Mongol invasion, that would have been like 1200, and then around 1500, 1550, somewhere around that, Japan goes into this sort of self-imposed period of isolation, and they have this rule that if any foreigner shows up, you just kill them. And
and there were some exceptions to this, but it was basically it was like basically,
there's like one port open, and you can only trade with the Dutch.
Correct. And there was a little bit of Portuguese involvement and whatever. And there was some down here, and I live in Okinawa. Down here in the Ryukyu region, there was a little bit of gray. There was a useful problem existed here, where China claimed that they owned Ryukyu, and Kyushu claimed that they owned Ryukyu, and Okinawa played the middle. The kings of Okinawa played the middle. In fact, they played the middle so hard that China thought there was like one king of Okinawa, and Kyushu thought there were three. And they never told anyone the truth. They just fucking they played this game of wacky lies to create for them this really comfortable trading space between the middle, which was really interesting. Anyway, so these kind of gray situations aside, basically Japan shut down. And at the same time, they they cut themselves off. I don't mean shut down. They cut themselves off from the outside world. And just prior to doing that, was when Japan became unified politically into a single political system of actual control, like authority. Well, not control, because there's this thing, but authority.
Right, and then so the 300.
That's orthogonal to the emperor.
Right.
And so you have the emperor, but then you also have the shogunate. That's like the political authority.
The emperor rules but does not govern. That's the sort of Japanese phrase.
Right. Yeah. He rules, but he doesn't govern. And it's kind of like he's a spiritual ideal of what Japan is culturally. And everybody feels some connection through that is kind of one of the ideas of nationhood here.
It's almost like the role that the royalty plays in Japan is sort of the Britain of Asia, in a sense. They're sort of isolated from the rest of the continent. Great naval power, very kind of similar, it's almost isomorphic geography situation. Kind of if you need, and in a similar way, they kind of are if you kind of need something to fill in, if you're coming from more of a European background and you don't know much about Japan, it's Britain, but in Asia. They're British people with slanty eyes. That's not 100% correct, but it's kind of almost.
It's a bit of it's a bit of an analog, and to include the idea that Britain became the United Kingdom, and Japan became from the fiefdoms became a single kind of polity, and there's under the shogun.
And there's still there was this long battle to conquer the northern half of the islands, similar to Britain. During the time of Newton, there's these like people in Edinburgh, who are like getting raided by these Scottish tribesmen, and are like terrified, and they're like, anyway, you kind of had a similar situation in Japan. So isolation period that lasts for 300 years. What's that called? The Edo period? Is that right?
There's a crossover in periods, but towards the end of it's kind of Edo.
So the idea, as I understand it, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, the idea is this is sort of the height of Japanese civilization, and this is like this was like the ideal. And then this guy, an American naval admiral, Perry, shows up in about 1850. This is Japan's, now we're migrating into Japan's version of World War II. 1850 shows up and threatens to bomb, I don't know, was it Osaka or Tokyo? Basically
I
shows,
believe it was Tokyo. Yeah.
yeah, as the shows up in Tokyo and says, "Okay, open the country, or I'm going to bomb your harbor." And they're like, they're 300 years. That they have like spears and sticks and shit. I don't know what type of weapons they actually have, but they don't have a modern advanced navy because they've been isolated from the rest of the world. So
Right.
1550 to 1850, that is the golden age of European colonialism.
Hmm.
And so during that time, all of the European colonial powers are rapidly advancing their navy to the point that every European country, you look at a map, you look at Europe versus Asia, and you can imagine how good your navy has to be able to, for these tiny little countries in Europe, to be able to exert naval power in Asia.
Hmm.
So anyway, Japan wakes up in 1850 from this like 300-year slumber and looks around and says, "Holy shit, every country in Asia is being colonized by white people. So
Right.
we're obviously next. So we either succumb to being a colony, or we're going to fucking colonize all of Asia, and we're going to be the colonizers." And so,
Hmm.
that's not a difficult decision for them. And so for the next 40 years, about, summarizing again, there's this sort of discovery period. They sort of send people all over the world to figure out what's going on. Rapid technological advancement during this time, probably the most rapid period of industrialization in the history of the world.
Yeah, that's the greatest leap forward any society's ever taken was that particular one. And just to kind of drive the point home about the technology gap, um, the weapons, the samurai sword and the archery of the day and the way horses were done and armor technologies and all this, they had for 300 years refined these to perfection by the time Perry showed up. But what you had was perfected 300 years obsolete stuff.
Right.
And it was like, it's kind of insane. Um, it's like, get the best 1950s hot rod, perfect it, take it all apart, overhaul the whole thing, make it perfect. Now pit it against a Tesla.
Right.
And it's like, this is not even, you're not even playing in the same dimension anymore. Um, the American stuff was all hokey and weird and absolutely jalopified if you look at the structures of some of the ships that Perry had. But it's because they were generational technologies were coming out so fast that the ships were literally cobbled together from new good ideas stacked on top of old ones. And the whole thing was a big giant jalopy, but it could bomb Tokyo.
And
Well,
so around 1890, that's the beginning. 1891, I think, is usually the year, is basically the start of what's called the Meiji Restoration, which I believe Meiji was the name of the emperor at the time. And
right.
basically, you have a centralization of power in Japan, and it's not even clear that the emperor is actually the one in charge, but whatever, forgetting that. This is
Well,
Japan.
okay, but this gets to your question about Japanese politics, though. I'd said that there's the emperor that's sort of a spiritual leader in some sense. He's also got a somewhat of a political role, but it's very gray. There was a shogun that had actual authority, right? Then below that, you've got the feudal system where the different daimyo and tono, subordinate positions, they're like feudal lords, right?
Right.
Below him, um, all throughout the country. On a totally different overlay, you had businesses. And those businesses, it's sort of like it's kind of like you look at a map of the cardiovascular system of the human body, and then you look at the lymph system, and it's a similar but different map. And then you look at the nervous system, and it's a similar but different map also. You've got these overlays like that. So you have the temple lines of authority and influence. You have the shogun's more direct influence it's overtly political, and then you have company and commercial influences that go back. I mean, we have corporations here that are over 1,000 years old.
So
Um,
one thing that I think Westerners need to understand in the West, there's this very strong idea of sovereignty. There's always somebody, there's always some organ of society that is sovereign, that is literally above the law.
Right.
In Rome, you have the emperors. Um, you know, in the U.S., you have sort of the government is supreme. The government is sort of the final rewrite layer. It's sort of like the kernel in an operating system,
Hmm.
and you don't quite have that in Japan. You more have these sort of parallel systems that are it's almost like the way the American Constitution allegedly works, where you sort of have these three co-equal branches of the government, whereas in Japan, sort of something similar evolves in a more sort of organic, decentralized manner.
Right. Right. So there's this idea here of balance. There's balance and there's kind of elegance, and actually that sense of elegance is actually offended by the jalopy nature of these wacky warships of the day, because they were not refined and properly integrated. That gets into a different discussion about technology concepts, but there's a social component to that as well. And somebody having too much power at once is clearly going to slip into a dirty path. Uh,
Right.
and
Right.
that's not an explicit rule, though. It's everything's kind of vague and bendy over here. But the idea, so the major restoration, right? What that was is when we say the emperor, the Japanese emperor, and I say that he didn't necessarily have political authority. There's times in Japanese history where the emperor was like a starving pauper, like a poor person. And then there's other times when the nation's rich and the royal household has all kinds of cool stuff. It's not this singular story of I'm the king, therefore you owe everything to me. I'm it. I'm
Right.
the end of it all. That's not quite how it works here, and it never has. So the Meiji Restoration was this kind of unique moment where the industrialists had an incentive, the business arm, right? They had this incentive to become the new industrialists. The emperor was supportive of that view, therefore the people went along with it, and the shogunate there was a big conversion in the shogunate at the time, where that went from being the a standing military force that was based on the military class, that is the aristocracy whose domain is violence professionally. It went from being that to Japan trying to convert to a professional army, which is a little bit different, where you have assigned ranks and things like that. And it doesn't go through, you try to get rid of nepotism, though it's always impossible to stamp out completely. One of the big elements of the Meiji Restoration was that the advisors to the emperor and the industrialists were encouraging this because they didn't like the shogunate. They wanted to subordinate the shogun to the emperor while keeping the ear of the emperor themselves. So there was a little bit of conspiracy of industrialists against the old order of the military aristocrats. So the samurai class was generally unseated in this period. And that's what some of the larger civil wars of the period were about, was settling exactly who's in charge and what does authority mean. If we're entering into this new world where we're going to have to be, okay, the Mongol invasion, right? The reaction to that was essentially local, and it was all the local daimyo banding together to fight off the outsider. There was no way to get a message back to Tokyo in time to say, rally the troops at a national level and get everybody against the Mongols. That's not how it was able to work because, the technology didn't permit that. So control was much more local, and the organization was spontaneous. The Meiji Restoration was about, hey, the colonial powers are so organized globally that they've taken over all of Asia, and Japan's going to have to band together again against everybody else who's not Japanese again. But this time we're going to have to coordinate centrally in a way that we've never done before, which means that the shogunate's going to have to be on the same page with the emperor and the industrialists, which has never happened. And we're going to have to force, for this reason, we're going to have to take some of the shogunate's power away and subordinate them into a standing professional Western style military, because it looks like that's the way that war is won now. So we're going to have to do things like standardize. Not everybody has their own swordsmith anymore. We're going to have to agree on what the caliber everybody has is, so we can set factories up to make ammunition.
Right. Everything.
Things like that.
This is just a thing whenever you centralize. This, I wrote that article called Standarditis, and I don't think I quite understood the whole point I was making, but it was the idea that as things become centralized, they also have to become more standardized, because everything has to sort of be fungible. If your sword breaks, you have to be able to just grab an identical sword. Everybody, like
yeah, reloading is a perfect example of this.
Right.
And England went through this during the 100 Years' War with the longbow. They went through this period where they had this massive nationwide system of, like, every village owed the armory at the Tower of London. They owed them so many thousands of arrows every month. And the baggage train of the English army had to know what the weight of I don't remember what they call it. There's like a certain name for the bundles of arrows. What the average weight of those are, which means how large and long they are. So how many they can fit into a cart of a specific size. So they had to go through all the standardization process, back in the 1600s, to fight the 100 Years' War. And Japan had to catch up with that, where there were local standards for things like within a certain prefecture, but making a national standard for things like this, that was kind of new, and that required subordination of the shogunate. And now, it probably could have gone smoother if the whole case had just been made directly to the shogunate, but it wasn't. The industrialists were making a power grab, even at the extremely dangerous point Japan was in. They were still trying to play like power games. So there's kind of this. Today, there's a lot of shade cast on the role of the industrialists in this period, for a couple of reasons. One, that they made some decisions for profit reasons that you could say for expeditious reasons on the one hand, or you could say it was to increase profit on the other hand, which is actually the truth, is probably somewhere in the middle. But some things that cause strategic problems going further down the line, one of them is like the rail width. The Japanese standard rails, they kind of made these dwarf rails that weren't good enough as the war progressed and handicapped Japan. The size of your rail, the gauge of rail that you pick for your country is not something you can change later.
Right.
Not very easily.
And so another thing to understand is Japan has geographically sort of two major problems. They're blessed and cursed geographically, much like Britain. They're blessed in the sense that it's very, very hard to invade Japan, as the Allies discovered. It's very hard, and anyway, it's very hard to invade Japan, but also Japan is severely lacking in natural resources. And so that is part of why they need to colonize the rest of Asia. Is they need oil from. I'm sharing a map of the extent of the Japanese Empire. They need oil and shit from the Philippines and sort of the
South China Sea area, Southeast Asia area.
Southeast Asia. And at the same time, so 1891, between 1891 and 1941 is when you have the rise of communism. And at this point in time, you also have the collapse of the Qing dynasty in China, and and the Chinese Civil War. Sorry.
Right, an internal collapse that the British expertly exploited to take over, similar to what they did in India.
The Opium War it's a fascinating period of history. And anyway, Japan starts taking over parts of China. They invade Korea. I mean, you can look at the map that's on the screen. And the Chinese Civil War is another fascinating period of history, even just from China's perspective. But so World War I ends in Europe, and I guess what was it called? I'm thinking in like math terms, the exterior powers and the interior. They were called the Central Powers, and what were the Allies called?
Oh,
I don't remember. Basically, the same. It's almost the same basic picture as World War II. The
Yeah, I
Allies,
think it was just called the Allies. I'm
I don't remember.
trying to think now what it was, but yeah,
Anyway, but the sort of Russia,
the
France, and
British,
Britain,
French, America, Russia alliance,
right? That
more or less.
alliance wins World War One in Europe, which was
With the
by
Italian switching
right,
slides right at the end.
right, which again was no means a given, but by no means a given that they were going to win, but they did win. And Woodrow Wilson, who's the president of the United States, comes up. He was sort of this was the beginning of Globo Homo, so this is like 1918,
Mhm.
and this
With
is
League of Nations and so
right
on.
right before like the Russian Revolution even, and
So, one of the interesting features of the beginning of Loa Homo and Woodrow Wilson, League of Nations, and the Treaty of Versailles, this is, I think, the first time. I'd have to check, but I think this is the first. It's certainly the first major instance of the language of justice being like law enforcement being applied to war.
right. So basically, in Europe, the Allies decide that the war, which was just a complete disaster for everyone involved, because basically the rifle had advanced to the point. I can't remember exactly, but basically you had this awkward situation, sort of similar to the American Civil War, where basically the infantry. You're going to be able to explain this better than I can, but basically the infantry weapons had become so advanced that sort of ground invasions with infantry doing sort of traditional marches was no longer feasible. You sort of had this trench warfare, and the tank was not an advanced enough technology. The tank was the main thing in World War II, and so that's why the hero of World War II from the American side is Patton. Who was the British guy? Was it Alexander?
Montgomery.
Montgomery, sorry. Patton, Montgomery, and Rommel are the big generals in World War II, and I'm sure.
Yeah, and every one of them was a combined arms guy, right? So
Right,
like tanks supported by infantry with
right,
anti-tank guns and
right.
artillery
With
and air support.
with the
That concept was this new thing.
with the exception of the Battle of Stalingrad, which is a major battle, but with the exception of the Battle of Stalingrad, sort of every decisive battle in World War II is either a naval battle or is a tank battle.
I wouldn't say tank combined arms battles more
Right,
accurate,
but Battle of El
but
Alamein, the battle anyway,
those really were tank. But yeah, the North Africa stuff really was like
right,
tanks were primary. It gets a little bit more mixed in Europe, but the idea that armor is a central and highly functional component of the fight that's a new thing that
right.
a lot of people didn't see coming. Rommel clearly did.
Rommel and Patton, who was a big fan
He
of
was a
like
student of Rommel's.
student of Rommel. Yeah, I mean he literally he read Rommel's book every single night. You know,
Yeah, which is a easy habit to fall into because it's a very good book, actually.
I got to read it. But anyway, so the point being is after World War One, basically the Allies decide the war is Germany's fault and war is illegal now. War is a crime now unless you're part of Globo Homo. And this is right at the time of this Meiji Restoration in Japan, where they're like, hey, you know what? Fuck you guys. We're not going to be a Globo Homo colony. And so, this situation, the tension in Asia, again, the rise of communism, you have the Russian Revolution that takes place shortly after World War II. You get the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. And the Chinese Civil War that takes place, where you had the Kuomintang and the CCP, whatever, fighting in China. And I forgot my point. Oh, so, I don't know, maybe the end of the 1930s, the U.S. imposes a naval embargo. I can't remember. They imposed some sort of naval embargo on Japan and basically tried to cut off the supply of oil. Maybe the U.S. bought the Philippines. I don't remember exactly how it worked. Maybe we should look at a map from Japanese Empire 1941. Let's find it.
I think my favorite, right? So the Japanese Empire, there had been campaigns going back to the 1890s.
Right.
So Japan had already been at war for a long time, taking over northern Manchuria, Korea, Taiwan, so on. So from the Japanese perspective, World War II does not start with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It starts, 40, 50 years before that.
Right. Right.
In terms of because it's a much longer campaign, and preparation for that goes all the way back to 1861, right? So the
Right.
idea that this is a transformation of society in the interest of survival. There's one of those rare cases in history where a society is staring a selection filter straight in the face, and they say,
Right.
how do we reorganize to deal with this? And there were kind of winners and losers from a personal perspective within that reorganization, which is, again, part of why the industrialists got kind of a bad name for themselves. But over the long term, this is also why you can, there's a strong argument to say that Japan won World War II from the
Right.
perspective of somebody,
I want to get
from the perspective of the Meiji Restoration.
I want to get to that. But okay, so this is a good map. Oh, let me share my screen. Okay. So we have the Japanese Empire in 1931. It's Japan, Taiwan, Korea.
Right.
By 1938, they've invaded Manchuria. And in 1942, at this point, the U.S. remember the U.S. owned the Philippines at this point. Japan invades the Philippines. They start taking over the European colonies in Southeast Asia.
Right. So this is that 1942 shaded area there. What had happened between 1938 and 1942 was a consolidation and build up, and the attack on Pearl Harbor was immediately prior to the invasion of the Philippines and French Indochina. It's funny they put Thailand actually here. That's not actually accurate. Thailand was not part of.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Thailand.
Thailand has sort of had like trade. It was closer to being a trade agreement, but
Right. They cut a deal with Britain first, and then when Britain's star was falling, they cut a deal with Japan, and Thailand's maintained its independence the entire time.
So I'm trying to find when the naval embargo happens.
I believe that was in the
So 1930
mid 30s.
Okay, 1937 is now this is one of the most interesting pieces of sort of historical fake news is the Nanking Marathon. That's December of 1937, which
Right.
is sort of uh, if you sort of read the version from China and from the West, again, you have to consider this in the context of the two. There's only three party. There's three sides to this story. There's China's point of view, there's Global Homo's point of view, and there's Japan's point of view. And so in the West, you hear China's point of view, you hear China's side of the story, and you hear Global Homo's side of the story. And you don't hear, and Japan's side of the story is more like so it's more like any other. How do you say this? It's sort of like it's sort of more like the Romans taking over Sicily, right? Or the Roman siege of what was the city where Archimedes lived? Syracuse. It's closer to it's more a story like that. But again, if you're a global homo, all war is a crime, which is
Right. So
a very global homo
historically,
idea.
up until this point, historically, sacking a city
Right.
is kind of what you do.
Right.
And Nanking was sacked. That includes some, rape and pillage. But to transform this from something everybody would understand as situation normal, which is the city was sacked, to convert that into a crime and
Right.
make everybody feel that this was devious and devilish and evil.
We
They inflated the death toll to Nazi levels,
Right.
where more people are claimed to have died in Nanking than lived in the entire region.
Right, and you also have to understand the way Allied propaganda works. So
The racist stuff from the day is absolutely comedy gold, though.
Okay, my point is that the Allies were not like they fucking firebombed Dresden.
They firebombed Tokyo too,
Right.
and the goal of doing those fire bombings, which people have to keep in mind, is the people that are saying that Japan was like the most evil country in the world because they sacked Nanking and massively exaggerated the violence that occurred. There was some violence that occurred, and actually the officers that were in charge of the men that did that were executed by the Japanese military. They were like, this was against what happened was in violation of even Japan's own regulations, and they did discipline those guys. But the sum total of bad things that happen in Nanking is blown dramatically out of proportion,
Right.
Because the entire source truth of the story of Nanking comes from a novel that was written by a lady who was never there. And that is what the Communist Party says is the truth, period. So, no matter what, if you question that, you're bad.
One thing for America.
Anyway,
go ahead.
The Americans, though, they firebombed Dresden and they firebombed Tokyo, knowing, in particular in the Tokyo case, they knew that the city was largely based on wood and bamboo buildings, and that there were no men there anymore because they were all at war. There were elderly and children and women that were there.
And where exactly? Sorry, I meant
the residential suburbs of Tokyo.
Right.
They firebombed those with incendiary devices, never even attacked the factories, and the entire purpose was to murder the women and children, hopefully to demoralize the Japanese Navy once they got word of it. This is... There's no way we would not call this the absolute most insane war crime possible.
And so anyway, like the way that like the World War II is taught in American schools now is that it was a crusade to save the Jews from the Holocaust, which
is crazy because people didn't know about that yet.
Well,
not really.
Sort of. The American public did not know about the Holocaust because the American government covered it up and the American press covered it up. And the way that I like to think about it, the Salzburger family, which is Jewish, owned the New York Times. Now you have to understand Hitler's perspective. Hitler genuinely believes that there's this secret Jewish cabal that controls the United States. And so his idea is, I'm going to hold the Jews hostage to get what I want. And this is his idea. And then he doesn't understand that, the Salzburger family controlled the New York Times and the Jews did actually control the media. They had no influence over the government, really. And what else? And also, like, the way that the American Jews thought of the Yiddish Jews is sort of the way, like, they hear about Hitler, doing the pogroms and doing all the shit to the Yiddish Jews. And the way that they're thinking about it is kind of the way that today we think about what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs, where like we look at it and we hear the reports and we see all this horrible shit that happens, and we go, that's not good, but also they're Muslims, so you know what, good riddance. And that's kind of the attitude that the American Jews are taking towards these Yids, which are like, okay, Hitler's getting rid of the Yids. All right, you know what? Maybe that's not the best thing, but you know what? Fuck them. That's sort of what's going on in America at the time. And so the point, we wanted to talk about the incident today, but there's obviously, Japan's one of the oldest countries, oldest continuous civilizations in the world. There's a lot of historical and cultural context that goes into this. And Japan's version of World War II, from Japan's perspective, America starts World War II in 1850 with the Perry thing, but also it's like Japan has sort of been in this constant sort of almost jiu-jitsu match against global homo. Right.
And so that kind of fast forwards us up to... I'm glad that we talked through that context, just because there's a lot to understand if you say, what's the perspective of a person who's a Japanese nationalist? Well, pack all this context in there.
Right.
first before you start even discussing, because you have to have the perspective. What's the location from which he's viewing the situation? What's the angle he's got on the current situation with, remember, we've just gone through 2.5 years of watching the world tear itself apart over a fake